Hey everyone, Mike here. Just want to let you know that the stream that you're about to watch was recorded via the DevOps Lounge. Head on over to chat.learndevops.com.au. You'll be forward to Discord. I really hope that we get to connect soon. Enjoy the stream. What it's like doing DevOps at an enterprise-sized company. So I'll speak to this from my perspective. Again, remembering that I'm a contractor, so I move around a lot. You just saw my LinkedIn. For those watching the stream. And if you go and look at my LinkedIn, then you'll see that I've worked for some pretty large organizations. So off the top of my head, you've got the Queensland State Government, not really an enterprise per se, but they're still extremely large. You've got Suncorp, massive bank, about 18,000 employees. And then we've got BHP, it's a mining company, who are about 88,000. And then although not a large enterprise, we've got like Flight Centre, who are pretty big. And then you've got Esri, who again weren't massive, but they were in the enterprise space. So I've worked at an enterprise level for some pretty large companies, and I've done both private and public sector. So I guess I feel qualified to answer sort of the question of what it's like doing DevOps at an enterprise size company. So essentially, it varies incredibly wildly. So the first thing I think I should do is define DevOps. So essentially, DevOps is about we've got an idea. We want to write some software to solve that idea. What does the whole end-to-end process look like from the ideation through to the customer using the software? It's actually being delivered to the customer via a web browser, a static binary, or whatever it is. And DevOps goes across that entire spectrum, and it talks about communicating, planning, talking to each other, ideation, all this kind of stuff at the very beginning here. Lots of collaboration, lots of planning, breaking all those tasks down, and then you get to sort of a next step over, which is this is where then the dev and the ops essentially comes into it from a title perspective, and the developers and the operations team are now working very tightly on that plan and all of those components that have been broken down. They're now looking at talking to each other, and this is the critical part: is they're looking at talking to each other and going, well, what tech stack are you going to use? What languages are we going to use? What CI stack are we going to use? Where are we going to store our code? What Git workflows are you going to use? How are we going to patch servers? Are we going to use Kubernetes? What cloud provider? Are we going multi-cloud? Are we going to try and abstract it with something like Kubernetes, and so on and so forth? So there is a lot that goes on here. But then the next stage then is going into the sort of operations CI perspective. And this is where like your SRE sort of slots into that DevOps umbrella. I want to talk about this at another point, but I want to point out that I believe that SRE fits into the DevOps umbrella. Brandon, one of our staff members here on the DevOps Lounge, works at a huge scale as an SRE and agrees that if you're doing SRE, you're not necessarily doing DevOps, but if you're doing DevOps, then you are doing SRE, or you can do SRE. So then you get to the end of the DevOps cycle, and that's all about automating all the workflows in order to create an extremely tight software release cycle within an organization. So that's essentially what DevOps aims to do. But just don't forget that it's not just this technical side on the right. It's also this communication side over here on the left, about the collaboration, communicating and breaking down silos and sharing knowledge, etc. So that's very sort of high level, quick overview of what DevOps is. So how does that work in reality in big enterprises? So the first note that I have here is big enterprises are fragmented. They are really fragmented. So one of the organizations I mentioned previously, they had a desire to move people over to infrastructure as code using Terraform. So for them, that's sort of like going, well, what does that look like? We've got tons of applications spread out across hundreds of pieces of software. I think they had about 650 projects, individual software projects developed individually, 650. So they were huge, absolutely massive. With each software solution becomes a department, and with a department comes a layer of management. And then that layer of management is then different for every single one of those projects. Every single one of those little projects has this layer of management on top that's different. They have their own principles, they have their own values, and therefore it's extremely difficult to get standard across the board in a very large enterprise from a DevOps perspective. One organization will gladly use Terraform, but they may not do it to any sort of standard, whereas the next department within a large organization will use standards to the best of their ability. And so you get very different contrasting code bases there, where this is just really difficult to maintain and this one is very highly polished and extremely easy to maintain. So I tend to find that there are no standards across the board. I tend to find it's very, very difficult to easily move between these business units within a large enterprise environment, because you're almost starting again, essentially. Almost starting again. The second note I've got here, which is one of those clients did exactly this. Most enterprise organizations try and create a centralized cloud team. And so one of those organizations essentially wanted a team that focused on providing Terraform modules and code bases to extremely high standard, IAC, infrastructure as code, CI pipelines around that code, so that customers, obviously other departments, could then consume those modules knowing that they're going through a certain strict set of standards regarding testing, linting, static analysis. So they did a Terraform FMT, did a Terraform validate, and then they did a TFSec. That was the very basic pipeline they just had in place to begin with, and then it was going to organically grow from there. And that was in front of every single module, so that customers could look at those modules and say, I know that that's being tested to a relatively high standard, much higher than what we would do ourselves, based on industry best practice. They wanted things like Sentinel into Terraform Cloud and so on and so forth. So they attempted to do that. But the problem is the team itself had no authority to tell other teams that they had to use the Terraform modules. So every single business unit, or like 650 of them, could really just say, nah, because the team couldn't mandate and the management above them weren't willing to mandate, because you've got politics, you've got people in the way. So they don't have the authority to say, you have to use these modules. They can only do basically their job was to do the best job they could to make the modules as attractive as possible to get other business users to use those modules. So it's very difficult in a large enterprise because of the fragmentation to build any kind of standards, especially when there's no authority given to enforce those standards. Different teams use different tech is another point. So obviously with those examples, 650 units, that software could be written in virtually anything. Could be written in Go, could be written in Python, could be written in Java. So all of that different tech means that it is actually quite hard to standardize in some cases. And so you're going to find that there's a lot going on. There's a lot of moving parts, and all those moving parts are made from different components. And so it's actually can be quite difficult to get DevOps practices in. It's almost as if you can't really do DevOps at an enterprise level. You can only do DevOps at a sub-enterprise level, i.e. within the individual business units within inside of the enterprise, because attempting to do it across the entire board and get everyone on board may not be feasible, may not work. And so you might just have to say to individual teams, you have to do DevOps in this way, to use Agile, you have to do this, so on and so forth. We're agreeing on these particular tech stacks. Moving forward for anything new that's built, anything that's existing, we're going to start deprecating and look at moving over. But overall, it's extremely difficult. It is extremely difficult. If you're going to take a job in a large enterprise as a DevOps engineer, my advice would be to see whether you're working on something existing or something new. If you're working on something new, something greenfield within that enterprise, then it could be a fun adventure in a large environment with lots of money. However, if it's something that's existing, then brace yourself for a lot of BAU, a lot of red tape, and a lot of difficulty trying to get new ideas in. It's the unfortunate reality of large enterprises. Teams that are using the same tech won't implement it correctly. So again, going back to Terraform, one team uses Terraform, another team uses Terraform, but one team might not have any Terraform expertise on it, but they want to use it. And so the code quality is going to be very different. The implementation is going to be very different. One's going to be a very low quality and one's going to be very high quality, because one team does have Terraform expertise and the other team does not. So it's going to be very different implementations across the board. Enterprise orgs will adopt a tool and end up with amateurish code powering critical systems. Sort of, I've duplicated my note a little bit there, but what I'm saying there is, again, if there's a new tool that comes on board that does solve a problem, but there's no talent, or the company, the culture doesn't permit innovation and testing and trying new ideas, then you'll find that tools will just be put in place in a really rough manner. It's very rough behind the ears, very rough around the edges. And so you're just going to get a really poor amount of quality. So yeah, and other problems. So DevOps isn't always implemented in a complete fashion. So we just had a little overview there of what DevOps is. Agile sometimes isn't used. I've gone in and there's been some kind of mix between sort of like Scrum and Kanban, or Prince and Scrum, and you get like these kind of like really strange sort of like pseudo DevOpsy practices. It's very difficult to stick to the Agile manifesto. That I accept, but most organizations will try and create something that they think fits their culture better, and it can result in some extremely odd ways of working. Despite the fact that DevOps also attempts to break down silos, enterprises have massive, very tall, thick-walled silos, and pretty much always will have. There'll always be that one guy that's been there for 8 years and knows everything, versus the newbies that hardly know a thing, because documentation is extremely difficult to get right, and it can be slow to get things in place. This is generally just an enterprise thing, not necessarily a DevOps thing, but from a DevOps perspective, it is about iterating tight feedback loops. It's about taking feedback with regards to what's happening, what customers want, metrics that you're seeing, and so on and so forth, and trying to get changes in place to solve that can be difficult, even when it's actually affecting the product itself. Unless money is being lost, then that tends to be quite a good motivator for management to move on and allow you to actually try something new. But other than that, it can be very slow, and it can be very, very difficult to get any sort of change in place. Very nice.